Buenas tardes. Muchas gracias. Thank you for having me on this call this evening, and I hope you're all well and safe and enjoying this evening's conversations. What I wanted to do this evening was to spend some time, about 40 minutes, presenting some thoughts on community engagement and community building, and how that can be done in a way that includes people who are often pushed to the edge of our communities. Okay, often we think about the word inclusion very much from an individual perspective. We think about including somebody into an activity or somewhere. What I want to do tonight is to talk about how we can create places that are prepared to receive the gifts of people who have been excluded or who tend not to be seen as people with a contribution to community life. I know much of the work, in every part of the world really is trying to understand how to be more person-centered, as if somehow we have a way of people who are paid professionals or family supporters walking alongside people who are excluded in a person-centered way. And I think that's really important work. But tonight I want to talk about how, as I say, we can get communities working together to be more inclusive. So I'm going to share some slides to frame our conversation. I think that's often helpful in terms of the use of English, which is not, I know, for many people, their first language. So let me just call up my slideshow here. Here we go. So here's a question I want to invite you to consider over the next 40 minutes. If you imagine that you're trying to work with a community, a very diverse community, a community of place, and you're trying to create a culture of welcome and a culture of inclusion. One of the questions you might invite people in that community to consider is not whether they're prepared to include people who've been excluded, but rather to ask them, what do they care about enough to act upon with their neighbors? It's often the case that if we care about inclusion, or we care about the environment, or we care about health or sports, we will try to get the people that we're engaging with to care about what we care about. But one of the first principles of effective community building for inclusion is don't try to sell them on what you care about. Find out what they care about and start there. So if you're an organization that is passionate about inclusion and you're trying to work with communities of place, then it may be a good idea not to start with the idea of trying to get them to be passionate about inclusion, but rather to try to start and find out what they're passionate about first, to really begin to become good neighbors to the communities of place. Because you see, most communities don't care about what you care about. They don't even care about what you know in terms of inclusion until they know that you care about them. And I think this is one of the reasons why so many organizations that work in the disability sector have never really done community development very well. I know many do, but most don't. I think one of the main reasons they don't is because they are so focused on people with disabilities and their families that it's hard sometimes to get beyond that person-centered support and that narrative around inclusion to thinking in a community development way. And it's an important thing to consider here, because if inclusion is to be real in the Canaries, it must be real in the communities of the Canaries, not just in your inclusion institutions. It can't just be real in a program or between a professional and a labeled person. It must be real in the culture. Because I think the measure of inclusion isn't how included a person with a label is in a program or a service. I think the real measure of inclusion is how interdependent somebody with a label is in a natural, diverse community where they are seen, for their gifts. They are recognized as having a contribution to make, and those contributions are welcomed. So this is a big question, I think. How do we grow that kind of culture? How do we grow that kind of independence? Many, and I see it on your website, many of the narratives around inclusion are narratives that are based on independent living, living an independent life if you're somebody who's been labeled in some way. But the truth is, you can't be independent until you're first interdependent. You can't have independence without interdependence because we're social beings. And I think historically what happened across Europe was as we closed large institutions down and we moved into what we called community care 20, 30 years ago, what we really did was we took people out of big institutions and we put them in smaller institutions that happened to be in neighborhoods or villages or towns, but were still institutions nonetheless. So we called them community care, but they had neither community nor the care of the community in them. They were places with people with the same diagnostic labels or the same general labels sharing life together, but with very few interdependent reciprocal relationships between the wider community. And so that's the dilemma that I want to think about tonight. A way of thinking about this dilemma is to think about what it is that community in general can do and what it is you, maybe many of you on this call, I'm thinking in my mind of the 200 people who are listening, that some are family members, some are people with lived experience, some are professionals. But the smallest category, I imagine, I could be wrong, are people who are just generalists, who are interested neighbors. And I may be wrong in that, but certainly a way of thinking about how we advance inclusion is to think about it as a 3-lane highway, a motorway. You know, so if you imagine 3 lanes on a motorway, a way of thinking about progressing inclusion is to think that on one lane, there are things that communities, ordinary people living in local communities, local villages can do, even if they know nothing about inclusion. And in fact, not alone can they do them, but they can do them in a way that can't be done by institutions. So there's a whole set of things that can be done in the name of inclusion that are not done by paid or salaried strangers. They have to be done by near neighbors. And we know this over and over again. People know the difference between, for example, a voluntary befriending scheme and having a real friend or a real lover. And so we know the difference between choreographed relationships and spontaneous, authentic relationships. That happens in the first lane of the highway. And it's impossible as professionals to choreograph that or to pay for that to happen. We cannot buy that and we cannot program that space. When we do, the magic dies. So it is there because it's spontaneous and it's authentic. You can't fake it. The second lane of inclusion is where community, local people, ordinary residents, inhabitants, I think you might use the term, are working alongside organizations that are where paid professionals are supporting them. And maybe they're doing things together that they can't do apart. So this might be, for example, where we have community houses where the professionals are really linking quite closely into the life of community and they're brokering opportunities for the people who live in the community house to really have deep connections. I'll tell you a story about this shortly. The third lane, and it's where an awful lot of the disability sector has stayed, is the lane whereby the professional world does things for us. You know, so we as communities say, well, we've got people who have special needs, and so we're going to send them over onto the third lane to the place where there are institutions and there are qualified professionals. And that's the place that people like this go to. And the qualified people know what to do for them. So we'll send our people there. Of course, that's not inclusion, it's exclusion, and it's institutionalization. I think one of the dilemmas that the inclusion movement around disability faces all over the world is that to get out of the third lane, in other words, to deinstitutionalize people's lives, they must, at the same time as they decrease institutionalization, they must increase communalization. In other words, to get out of the third lane, you've got to improve the first lane. And I think this is where institutions that work in disability have a huge amount of opportunity to think and imagine in very different ways. And very much my talk tonight is about honoring the work that you're doing, because I think as I look at the work that you're doing as Plena Inclusión Canaries, I think what you're trying to do is just that. You're trying to deinstitutionalize by recommunalizing, because you recognize if you just deinstitutionalize, what you will end up doing is just creating another smaller institution. But if you grow community life, then you create a community alternative to institutionalization where real inclusion can take place. Now, why is it historically we haven't seen more community activity? We've seen a lot of person-centered work, a lot of independent living work, a lot of personal budget work, and a lot of circles of support. But actually, relatively speaking, we've seen very little community development. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons might be because it's so complex, it's so difficult. The other might be because we don't employ generally community development people to come work in the inclusion sector with people with disabilities. We tend to employ people who have experience of working with people with disabilities. We don't tend to employ people who have experience in working with general populations and general communities. And that might be something worth considering. So here's a question, two questions I want you to reflect on, because I want a little audience participation as I share so we don't lose track of each other as I present. And I want you to think about these two questions. When you think about your role and you think about early conversations where you're trying to build a bridge between somebody who's been excluded and the center of a diverse, interdependent community, how can you shift the conversation away from, thinking about being alongside somebody and asking them, what can I do for you? What can I do for your community? Or what can I do for you as an individual? To asking the question, what would you like to contribute to the well-being of your community? So I want you to think about that. Imagine maybe somebody that you're working alongside who you're trying to support towards inclusion, and really thinking about what gift have they got that they could contribute to community life? And where are the opportunities in a neighborhood or in a community of place where that gift could be received in a genuine way? So think about that for a moment. And maybe if you wish, you can put in the chat box your answer. It's not obligatory, but if you would like to. The other question I want you to think about for a moment is, what dilemmas do you face in adopting this approach, in shifting from seeing the deficit or the problem to seeing the asset, the gift, the possibility, both in the community and in the person who's excluded? Because one of the things I believe is we can often see the gifts of the person who's excluded, but because we feel so strongly about advocating in a person-centered way for them, we sometimes look to the community that's excluded them and we feel angry. We feel like it's a community that's hostile or old-fashioned or maybe just not very caring. And that might be true to a point, but in every community, there are islands of welcome. There are islands of inclusion. There are islands of possibility, and they are largely invisible. So I think a big part of inclusion is making the invisible visible. Let me stop for a moment and give you space to consider those two questions. And again, if you wish to share, you can do so in the chat box. These slides will be shared with you, and Berta and others can, I'm sure.
Sorry, excuse us because translator is not here. I think her connection fault. So if you please wait a second.
Sure.
Would you please? Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
How long do you need me to wait? Am I waiting for the translator, or am I waiting for people to?
For the translator.
I see. So do you think most people have lost what I've said up to now?
Just the last part.
Okay. Well, I can slow down and make the English. Yeah. I'll have a look at the chat and see what's.
She's here again, Cormac. So
she's here now?
Everything is okay.
Good.
Yes. Sorry.
Don't be sorry. No, I want people to be able to understand what I'm saying. So it's absolutely not a problem, honestly. So we're okay.
Yes, go ahead.
You know, one of the things you can help me do as well, Berta, is when I get to 30 minutes, because I get carried away, I'm very passionate about all of this. So can you let me know when we're 30 minutes in? And then when I have 5 minutes left, also let me know.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sure.
Sure. What's our time now? How much time have I left?
I'm not sure. Miriam, ¿cuánto tiempo le queda?
Hasta las 6:15.
In English?
20 minutes.
20. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, so the translator's here, which is great. So you'll have fun translating some of these English terms, I think. So let's see how this one goes. So one of the ideas I want to share with you, and I'm going to try and support our translator to make it really clear, is what I call the Helpers Crossroads. Now, let me explain this so it really is clear by using an illustration. And I think Berta has done some really nice graphics to explain some of my work as well. So, you know, we can hopefully share some of these afterwards as well if we haven't done so already. But I want you to imagine that you're thinking about trying to support somebody, a person who's been excluded. Now, in the old days, you know, maybe 50 to 100 years ago, I think a lot of the way that we supported people with disabilities was we did things to them and for them, and sometimes very, very violently. So in the very early days, for example, people, in some cases, people with disabilities were institutionalized for life. And in fact, in some countries, that still happens. So that's doing things to them. More recently, maybe 50 to 40 years ago, there was much more of a charitable model. So we did things for people with disabilities, but still very much the professionals were in charge. So even though we weren't doing things to them or institutionalizing them, we were still taking over their lives. To use that term, they were dependent on us rather than independent and interdependent in communities. A lot of the language I hear today around inclusion is the language of doing things with people with disabilities or people who, you know, are family members or allies of labeled people. So being alongside them. And I think that's powerful. So the person-centered movement is a really powerful movement of being allies, of being alongside people and standing shoulder to shoulder with people who have been exiled and marginalized. And that's a good thing. There is a fourth way of promoting inclusion. And the fourth way of promoting inclusion is to also support people who are labeled, people who are exiled or marginalized, excluded people, to do things by themselves. And I think we've done a lot of that as well. I can see it on the websites that I've reviewed today. But we could also get communities to do inclusion more by themselves. And that's what I want to call our attention to and just be curious about. I'm not saying it isn't happening already. I know it is. I guess what I'm suggesting is it would be great if we could do more of it and if we could support more communities to do it. Now, sometimes I don't know if it's true in your context, but certainly in many of the contexts I work in about 35 countries around the world, pre-COVID and now online. And it strikes me, I often hear people using the term empowerment. We want to empower people who are excluded. We want to empower communities to be more inclusive. And I am not sure that that is a useful term, because if I empower you, who's got the power? I do. And if I have the power, I can take it away. So I think it's more useful to think about creating the climate or the conditions within which people can self-empower and can collectively empower with local people. And that's where I want to go to next in this presentation, is to talk a little bit about that. If we had more time, I would ask you to think about where you are on this crossroads, these four different ways of showing up in people's lives as a helper. Do you spend a lot of your time, or does your organization, or maybe even your family, spend a lot of time doing things to and for people who are people who have a label in their lives? Or do you think, are you living life with people with labels? Maybe you're doing a lot that's about creating the conditions where they can live their own life. But are we also doing something about supporting the community to be in the life of people that have been excluded? So these are considerations, they're questions. Another question I want you to think about is, if we start working and we start thinking about the neighborhood as the primary unit of inclusion, not the individual, not the institution, but the neighborhood. We say we're going to try to create neighborhoods that are inclusive. Not necessarily just individuals who are included with the support of professionals or creating inclusive organizations. We're going to try and create communities that are inclusive. What courage would be required of you to take on that mission? What change would you have to make? What would have to be different? Let's go back to the 3-lane highway that I was talking to. We've heard a lot of people talking about the good life conversation and shifting from what's wrong with you to what's strong with you. What would a good day and a good life look like for you, and how might you live well in a neighborhood? So the 3-lane highway would say, well, we might also need to ask that question of the wider community. Because the danger is we can find out what somebody with a disability's good life looks like, but until we can actually broker that into a community and have the community genuinely receive the gifts of that person, it's never going to really be inclusion. Until we can have relationships with the community which are truly collaborative and co-productive, it's never going to be inclusion. And until the community can trust that we will do things that they can't in the 3rd lane, it's never going to be inclusion. So we need all 3 lanes. And I believe that that's the challenge ahead. That isn't just about consultation. That isn't about going out and consulting with the community. I think that's about building deep and enduring relationships with communities. One of the ways of doing this is having learning conversations in neighborhoods, where we start to really, like my opening slide of the presentation, really start to understand what is it people care about in communities? What are the local resources that they have that they can tap into? Who else might they invite in? I worked in one community once where I met a young man by the name of Joop, and he wasn't young, he was a little bit younger than me, but he was 40 when I met him at the time, and he lived with his mother. And Joop had multiple labels, and he was very, very frightened of social situations. He had no relationships in the community, and his mother was at end of life. She was nearing death. So she was very, very anxious about dying, and she felt that Joop was very disconnected and couldn't die in peace, essentially, she felt, because she was so frightened. Through community building, a community builder was placed in that neighborhood, and the community builder was trained in asset-based community development. She had lots of conversations as a community builder like these ones, with these questions that I've shared here with you. And eventually she heard about Joop and his mother, and she visited the house and had a conversation with both of them. And she discovered that Joop was passionate about stamp collecting, and in fact had learned an awful lot about plants and various kinds of flora and fauna from collecting stamps. As she talked to other members of the community, one of the issues that she identified was that people who went on holidays were very concerned about their plants when they were away from a holiday, when they were away from their houses. And so this community builder connected the people who were concerned about their plants before they went on holidays with Joop, who knew a lot about plants. And even though Joop would not meet them, he refused to meet any of the neighbors. When the neighbors would bring their plants to Joop's house and give the plant to Joop's mother, and Joop would pass it on, a connection was formed that was comfortable for Joop and also comfortable for Joop's mother. This gave Joop's mother a huge amount of solace near the end of her life. Now, another interesting thing started to happen. Joop's reputation in that neighborhood changed from somebody who was antisocial and never interacted in the community to somebody who was known as the plant whisperer, somebody who looked after everybody's plants. And before Joop's mother died, she said something very poignant. She said, "I know that Joop doesn't have any physical connections yet with people in the neighborhood, but I like to think that the plants that he cares for, that their roots are stretching out of our house and back into the community and connecting my son. And because of his new role in this community, I can die in peace in the hope that he can live a connected life." So I think this is very powerful, because it's almost like what I'm describing to you is a way of mapping our communities, a way of finding out the hidden treasures. So often what we do in communities is we identify what's wrong. We have a map of all of the problems: health inequity, drug problems, high unemployment. So often when we look at communities, we see them as hostile places or problematic places. But imagine we had a map of the community that showed all of the assets, all of the strengths, all of the capacities, all of the potential. How much more easy it would be to do genuine inclusion that isn't just about referring people to an activity, but is truly about enabling people to build long-lasting connections. I'll finish with one more story. Over the years, I have had the privilege of recognizing that inclusive community building, which is what I'm speaking about here, has 8 features to it, 8 recurring practices, or what I call touchstones. And I'm not going to read them all to you now, because you can read them later yourself. But I want to finish this presentation with a story, which I think illustrates what I'm talking about. And it's the story of the Starfire Center. The Starfire Center is a center in Cincinnati, And for many, many years, for many decades, it was set up by parents of people with disabilities. But for many, many decades, it was a workshop placement. So people would go there from all over Cincinnati, from villages and neighborhoods in Cincinnati, and they would go there to essentially spend time during the day in day service, doing workshop activities, learning vocational trades and so forth. Most of them weren't very happy. They had about 150 what they called clients who went to those day services. Now, as we know in history, those day services, many of them, not in every country, but many of them have since closed. But still, in Cincinnati, up to about 10 years ago, this service was still there. The Starfire Center and its management committee decided they wanted to have a different conversation with the people who used the center and with the families. And as they listened to the people using the services of the center and the families, they started to realize that people were not happy, that people were very dissatisfied with the daycare and the day service experience, and they wanted a more genuine alternative. But what they were very frightened of was that the day service would shut down and there wouldn't be a community alternative, a genuine community alternative. And by the way, this has happened all over Europe in the last 5 to 8 years. So as austerity has kicked in and money is no longer available for disability services have been forced to close down day services, but haven't been supported or resourced to create community alternatives, meaningful community alternatives. And so they've been in a massive dilemma about this. But in any case, the Starfire Center wanted to try to resolve this dilemma and create real alternatives. So as they listened to the 150 citizens that they served and their parents and family members, they realized they had to change. So what they decided they were going to do was, first of all, working with the citizens that they serve and the families, they were going to repurpose their building into an enterprise center where they could rent out space to local businesses and local voluntary groups in the wider Cincinnati area, so that they could get rent, which they in turn then used to create a different model of care and inclusion. If you go to the Starfire Center today, what you will discover is 3 things, and I'll finish on this. The first is you'll discover a building that is a community building with huge diversity. So there are people from every walk of life using the building, including people with disabilities, and they come and go, and it's almost like a train station in terms of activity. The second thing that you will see is that everybody there is employed in some way. So what you have is you have people who previously were clients who came and received a service, who are now coming and they're employed by the service as community builders. They're paid to go back into their neighborhoods and do community building. They're paid to go and find those assets, the asset map I showed you earlier on. Their job is to go into their neighborhood and discover those assets. The third thing that you'll see is that the staff that remained have been trained to be co-community builders with people who are themselves living with various disabilities. And so they both go into neighborhoods and they do community building together as equal, as co-workers in the community. This has dramatically changed how people understand disability and inclusion at neighborhood level. And all across Cincinnati now, we're seeing something very profound. A new story is emerging, a story that says that neighborhoods are not places that send people with disabilities to services, but that neighborhoods are places that have the hidden potential of creating inclusion where people live. But the challenge is the services must figure out how to support them to do that. You see, in the final analysis, It is only when people who've been defined out of community secure the power to redefine community that our world gets better. So what I've said in conclusion is that we need to have 3 simple shifts. A shift away from starting our conversations with what's wrong with our communities to what's strong within our communities, and finding the inclusion that's there and building on it. The second is we've got to shift away from models of delivering service that we call inclusion services to a model of discovering inclusion and then building on that from the ground up, from the community up. And the final shift is we've got to shift away from our content to really promoting community contact. This idea that you cannot have an independent life unless you first have an interdependent life. So inclusion, I believe, is everybody's business. Thank you. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Cormac. Bueno, hay una pregunta que hay alguien que quiere realizársela y plantea lo siguiente. ¿Qué diferencias hay entre las consecuencias de generar apoyos pensando en el déficit de las personas o que se creen desde las fortalezas de las personas? Poli, ¿estás traduciendo la pregunta? Poli, ¿se me escucha? Ahora, hola, ¿sí? ¿Traduciste la pregunta? Vale, ok. Cormac?
Yes. I'm not hearing Polly. I'm not hearing anything except your voice.
Vale, Poli, ¿puedes pasar? Ok, bueno, yo en inglés. Vamos. Cormac.
Que se lo diga a Poli. Ah, no, claro, que Poli, que no la escucha, vale.
The
Cormac,
channel
si
Can
quieres,
you press the button of
intento decir yo.
interpretation so you can hear the translator making the question? You have to press the button of interpretation.
but
Oh, I see.
the word
Okay.
So you can
Nobody
hear the
told. All right.
translator, yeah.
English.
I see. I can. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Nobody told me to press that, so that's
Vale.
useful to know. I see. Okay. Okay. Good to know. All right, Polly. Good to meet you.
Poli, ¿quieres que te repita la pregunta?
Is this a feature of Zoom now? You can actually have translation like this. Ah, I see.
Okay, one moment, please.
Ah, I see.
The question. ¿Qué diferencias hay entre las consecuencias de generar apoyos pensando en el déficit de las personas o que se creen desde las fortalezas de las personas?
Well, I think one of the differences between seeing somebody's gifts, is the way I would put it, and seeing somebody's deficits, is that the deficit has the way of obscuring, of blocking my sight or my vision to the gifts. So if I say somebody has a problem, it becomes really hard for me to see past that problem, to see what their potential gift is. And this is a big issue if you're trying to promote inclusion, because most communities will have difficulty really genuinely including somebody based on their deficits, on their problems. The best you can hope for is if you link somebody with a deficit or a problem into a community, the best you can hope for is sympathy. Somebody in the community will feel sorry for them. And this is not a healthy relationship. If, however, you can support their gifts to be seen while also accepting their difference and their diversity, then the relationship is going to be much healthier. So if you're supporting somebody and, for example, they're a beautiful cook or they have a wonderful singing voice, and that's what they're known for in the community, or in my story with Job, where his gift was the ability to care for plants, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring or we don't recognize that Job has social phobias. But what it does mean is that he isn't just connected on the basis of his neediness. You see, if you go back to the story of Job, in Job's community, Job is needed, right? Now, because of what we did. Before we did the community building, Job was needy. He was needy. So we could only see his needs. And because of this, we had only the ability to connect him with his mother and other services and two people who were very nice Christian charitable people. But beyond that, nobody cared. So that's the difference. We've literally transformed Job's life because we focused on the strengths, not the deficits.
Vale. Hay otra pregunta, Mr. Russell, y plantea, ¿cómo pueden las administraciones públicas contribuir a las comunidades inclusivas?
That's an excellent question. How can public administrations contribute to inclusive communities? One of the first things they can do is do no harm. Don't do to or for communities what they can do for themselves. So I think one of the things that public administrations often do is they assume communities are incompetent, that they're hostile places that can't do inclusion. We see this a lot during the coronavirus. You know, we must get the schools back open because children are being abused and all sorts of bad things are happening. And that is true to a point, but it becomes a general truth. It's the story is institutions and professionals are more competent and capable at this than the uncredentialed community. So the first thing that a public administration can do is stop pathologizing communities. Stop putting communities down and families down. The second thing they can do is they can cheer communities on. In all kinds of ways, they can create the conditions within which inclusion is more likely. You know, the third is they can create the financial conditions where it is easier to be social and be supportive. For example, introducing universal basic income so people have an economic floor, which allows them to be more neighborly. And the fourth thing they can do is support the employment of community builders in every neighborhood who know how to help neighbors connect together like this and also promote inclusion. So currently, public administrations fund services and programs, and they say you can use this money to provide a program for people with disabilities. And then they fund another program, which is for older people, and another program for people with mental health issues. And what I think that needs to happen is that public administrations need to stop working in this silo-based way, and they need to work much more in a place-based way, much more holistically. Because if they work more holistically, there would be many more opportunities for inclusion than there currently are.
Vale. Cormac, otra pregunta. Plantean que si podrías explicar el
Sure.
perfil del constructor comunitario.
Sure. So the idea of a community builder, and another word we use is community animator, which comes from the French word animateur, which means to breathe life into something that's waiting. It's there already, So the idea is the assets are already there. The community builder is somebody who's a person, and who knows how to do the community connecting. So the role I was describing earlier on of the woman who knocked on Joop's mother's door and had the conversation. She is a paid person. She works in Javastraat in Amsterdam, in that neighborhood area. And her job is to help local residents to connect with each other and their local associations, their clubs and groups to connect. Her role is paid for by the city. And then she is managed by a local voluntary group, a local church. No, it's not a church, excuse me. I think it's a local parent-run organization. And her role is community-based, but she is very interested in inclusion because she doesn't want to create a neighborhood that's exclusive. So she is paid. That's what she does every day. She drinks lots of coffee with people locally and helps them figure out how to build relationships and make connections. So one day she may be talking with the choir, and she may, a few hours later talk with somebody who has a beautiful singing voice but isn't connected. And she will connect those people together. But also what she will do, or he will do, is they will create the conditions where connecting is more likely. So one of the ways that we teach to do this is they don't look like a lot of traditional community development practitioners work with community leaders. The difference with community builders is we don't look for leaders, we look for connectors. So connectors are people who often don't like meetings and are very quiet people, very shy people, but they're in all of our communities and they're very good relationship builders. So when we're doing community building, we look for those people and we then begin to help them and support them to make more connections. I did some work in many neighborhoods around the world, but one example of this, practical example, is the work in Birmingham community, an outer estate in Birmingham, the population of about 5,000 people. And 7 local residents and 1 community builder began to have conversations in each of the bumping places and the gathering spaces in the neighborhood. So outside of the schools, talking to parents, things like that. And they found 93 connectors. And they then went and thanked those connectors for what they did and invited them to come to a party, because why have a meeting when you can have a party, right? And when they asked each of the 93 connectors to come to a party, they asked them to bring 4 people from their block. So they literally went from 7 people to 100 people to 500 people in a neighborhood in a matter of weeks. Now, can you imagine what inclusion work you could do if you could connect 500 people in a population of 5,000 who are deeply connected with all of those 4,500 other people? And then you begin a conversation about inclusion, about what is your dream for your community in the next 5 years. And I think that's the work that a community builder can do. And it's very, very hard for an organization that employs people to work with people with disabilities to say to their staff, now you must go and do community building as well. Sometimes it's necessary to initially maybe employ some community builders and place them in neighborhoods to begin to open up that work.
De acuerdo. Cormac, y hay una última pregunta y plantea que si podría destacar los principales valores comunitarios.
Okay. So here's a way of thinking about how you would know that you're in a community. Okay. There are 3 features. The first feature is that the community would not measure itself by the strength of its leaders but by the depth of its associational life. So it would talk more about its ability to host and grow clubs, groups, social networks, rather than, oh, we have a wonderful mayor, or we have the best chair people of the neighborhood watch, you know, or our tourist committee are the best in the world and we've got a wonderful leader. They wouldn't talk about leadership. They would talk about associational life. I don't know if that translates very well, but what I mean by that is, you know, just like you have a flock of birds, you have an association of citizens. Yeah, I can be a beautiful singer, but I'll never be a choir on my own. I need an association of other singers. So they would put the emphasis on the choir, not the solo singer, right? That's the first thing. The second is all of those associations would intentionally have a welcome for the stranger at the edge. There would always be an empty chair for the person who hasn't arrived yet. Okay, that's the second. The third is that you would see in that community people behaving like citizens, not clients. What do I mean by that? You know that you're in the presence of citizens because they do three things. The first, they use their own language to define the possibilities and the problems. Institutions don't do it for them. They do it with their own words. Okay. The second is they define the solutions they think will work in response to the issues that they have shaped. And the third is they take action. They do something to bring the solution into being, into the world. It's nice to speak. We're doing it now. But ultimately, community is a verb. You've got to do it. It's a verb, not a noun. You live into, you act into community. So ultimately, I would say that communities are places that have sent their heroes home and are making hospitality, associational life, and gift exchange the point. So hopefully that answers your question.
Cormac, y ya que, bueno, te tenemos aquí, que es muy difícil que nos hayas podido conseguir compaginar tu trabajo y estar aquí presente, hay una última que yo creo que para las personas que trabajamos en las entidades que trabajan apoyando a personas con discapacidad es importante. Y bueno, esta de verdad que ya va a ser la última. Y hay una persona que nos plantea cómo podemos las entidades contribuir a que las administraciones remen en esta dirección.
Great question. Buy my book. Or at least read my book. So I've written a book on this question because I think it's such an important question called Rekindling Democracy, a professional's guide to working in citizen space. It's a good stocking filler. So I think in short, I'll save you the trouble of buying the book. I'll tell you what the punchline is. I think we have an inversion of democracy, where the role of the citizen is being defined as that which happens after the important work of professionals and organizations is done. So we have so many people who think inclusion is the work of the organization, our health is in the hands of the doctor, you know, the teacher teaches our children. And I think what we have to try to do really is we have to try to restore democracy and say, you know what, as professional institutions, we really need to say that in a democracy, the role of the citizen is primary, that we're there to supplement the work of citizenship, not to replace it. So I think that's the first thing. In European politics, it's known as the principle of subsidiarity. In the Canaries, you would know a lot about this because, you know, you think a lot about centralized and decentralized and devolved power, for example, and being autonomous, being able to make your own decisions locally. Well, that's true in communities too, right? So it's really important, I think, that as professionals, that we learn what we're not going to do to be helpful, how to serve while walking backwards, as well as doing things. I think most of our organizations were trained to do things, to fix problems, to provide services. And what I really want to emphasize here, this is for a much bigger conversation. Your last question really is for the next question for our next conversation, I think, but it's a wonderful question. I really think this is the question of the hour. You know, how can our institutions be of service to communities in a way that doesn't make our communities dependent, but makes our communities powerful and makes our communities, you know, so this idea that another way of framing the question might be to say, how could we organize our institutions the way people organize their lives? And instead of using our institutions to harvest people's needs, how do we use our institutions to build people's strengths and capacities so that we have the production of the masses rather than mass production? I could talk all night about this, and I don't really want to take up too much more of your time. But a simple idea here is to think about the Starfire Center again. That was an institution, a very traditional institution. But when they relocated the authority and the power to the people they served, to their families, and to the wider communities, what people said back to them is, we want a life, not just a service. So in the end, and this is the final comment I'll make, I think we need to get beyond service land. Services are the sea in which institutions swim. And we need to start thinking about ourselves much more as facilitators and as catalysts and as animators of community and civic action and citizenship. And I think if we could do that, and I believe we can, I work with hundreds and hundreds of organizations that are doing this. And in some cases, just on this morning with organizations in Singapore, where we're working across Singapore to change social care. So I know we can do this in an entire country. We're moving into a new chapter of how institutions understand themselves in the world. And I think a big part of how they're redefining their role is through the lens of asset-based community development. So shifting from what's wrong to what's strong.